Well, back in 1651, Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher and extensive writer and thinker in England, published a book called Leviathan, which contained a raft of philosophical ideas and concepts and scientific notions, some of which hold water and others of which no longer do so. But one of the ideas, or probably the idea actually, for which he is most well known these days, was what he termed the social contract. Now, 1651, we're talking a few years after the English Civil War had been fought and resolved, and Thomas Hobbes, during the war and continued after the war until his death in great old age, was a royalist. So he was on that side of the fence. And his argument around the social contract, partly it's about the necessity of royalty, the necessity of a monarch to lead a nation state rather than a Cromwellian figure or what these days we would refer to as a president or whatever term you want to use, but in other words, anything other than a king or a queen. So his idea was that all states fundamentally need kings and queens. But more key to it than that, in his notion of the social contract, is this idea that there is a relationship between people and the state. And this relationship can also be extended into other areas. For example, employment, which we'll get onto in a second. So there is a mutual relationship between the state. For Hobbes, that would be in the form of the king or the queen, but you could equally say in the form of a president or a prime minister or whoever, whatever else, between the state and the people, the citizens of the state. Now, it would mean that non-citizens, holiday makers coming in from abroad, recently arrived immigrants, people who've just come over on a dinghy from Calais, who are trying to gain citizenship but haven't got it yet. People in those situations, this wouldn't apply to them necessarily. So it's full citizens rather than people who are in a rather temporal flux kind of a situation where they're not quite one thing and not quite another at that time. So this mutual contract means that there are certain things that you gain from being a citizen, and there are certain things which you owe to the state in the form of the leader of your state, your monarch, your president or prime minister or whoever, and vice versa. So there are certain things which they gain, the leader of the state, they gain from their position, and the state itself as a corporate body, not just the individual prime minister or the individual king or queen, but the corporation of the state, which it gains from being the state. But in exchange, there are certain things they must give to the citizens. So it's a two-way street. And Hobbes's argument, of course, going through the whole Civil War period, is that when that relationship breaks down, it can break down from either side, in the sense that it could break down because the leader of state, the head of state, has ceased to fulfill their side of the contract, or it could break down because the population have ceased to fill their side of the contract. And in either direction, the other half of the party, when they are no longer gaining the thing which the contract gives them, that contract has been violated, they are then free to not fulfill their side of the contract because the other person, the other half rather, has already broken that contract. So at a very basic level, a very simple level, we could say that what do I, as a citizen of Britain, what do I owe to the state? Well, first and foremost, I have to pay my taxes. There is a contract that I pay my taxes. If I stop paying my taxes, does the state need to maintain its duties towards me? Would be Hobbes's question, at least. There are other things I owe the state. So the state produces sets of laws, and I'm expected to obey those sets of laws. And again, if I violate those laws, do I have the same rights? So does a convicted prisoner have the same rights as a free citizen? Someone who has been shown to break the law, do they have the exact same rights as somebody who has not, so far as anyone knows, broken the law? And Hobbes would say no. quite how many rights and protections are lost to the convict, well, that you could debate till you're blue in the face. What should they lose? What should they not lose? So a little while ago, a couple of years ago, there was a debate about whether prisoners should indeed be allowed to vote in general elections or not. Because at the moment, if you are at Her Majesty's pleasure in one of the various prisons around the country and an election rolls around, you're not allowed to vote in that election. Is that fair? Is it unfair? Hobbes would say, well, that could be a reasonable decision made by the state, that if you fail to live up to your half of the contract as a citizen, you will lose X, Y, and Z rights that are granted to obedient citizens. Equally, you could say in the opposite direction, if a head of state fails to fulfill their duties, what can we, the citizens, do about it? Well, obviously we have developed the process of general elections. So we now have the opportunity to try and get rid of, not the Queen as ultimate head of state, but the Prime Minister in our case, or presidents in various other countries. We can try and get rid of elected heads of state come the next general election. We could perhaps campaign, if we don't want to wait however many years it is to the next election, we could campaign for votes of no confidence and try and get rid of them a bit earlier. So there are legitimated ways of trying to depose someone who is seen to have failed to fulfill their contract, either as an individual prime minister, president, what have you, or indeed as a collective, that party in power, the whole lot of them are rubbish and we want to get them out, that kind of approach. So it may be at the individual level, that one particular leader or politician, it may be at the broader level, the whole bunch of them that are seen as not worth the hot air they puff, and there is a move to get rid of them. There are arguably less legitimate means, which is where we move into the sort of insurrectionist ethics of people like Lee McBride, in that we might argue maybe, well, let's say hopefully not so much Britain, because we are a very peaceful country by and large these days, but certainly there are various parts of the world where we can see examples of this happening, where any protest against the ruling powers tends to result in military action, citizens being rounded up, carted off, disappeared in the middle of the night, never to be seen again, or shot dead in the streets. Various extreme measures are taken for any kind of protest. And so if you're faced with that sort of a situation, do you just meekly put up and shut up, or do you seek to pull down the powers that be through insurrectionist methods, which might be relatively low-key methods of insurrection, disseminating propaganda against the people in power and promoting some alternative party or whatever it may be. Or it could be much more hands-on direct action, lobbing bricks through windows, going and assassinating some president, prime minister, whoever it might be in that particular part of the world. There's a whole raft of measures from the quite mild to the outright murderous and violent and full-on revolutionary. Hobbes was not in favour, absolutely not. Having lived through a civil war, he never wanted to see another one, as I suspect anyone in any part of the world who has lived through a civil war and seen the levels of bloodshed and members of families where, as the famous example from the English Civil War goes, of brother turning against brother, of father against son, and so on, of families murdering each other, denouncing each other, in political rifts within one family, let alone one community. If you've ever lived through that, and there have been plenty of civil wars in the world since the days of the English Civil War, then why the hell would you ever want to live through such a thing again? So most people would much prefer, which is why we've moved towards this democratic model, because it's much less bloodthirsty than revolution and upheaval and shooting people in the streets and all the rest of it. But I suppose the potential threat is there in a sense, and you could argue, certainly whereas theorists have argued that there looms the presence for the politically corrupt, that if they become too corrupt, too tyrannical, they can look to history, their own country or other countries, and see what happens to tyrants elsewhere when the people finally get so sick to death of it, there is a bloodthirsty uprising. And so the kind of encouragement to democracy and obeying the results of democratic processes, even if you don't much like the results of democratic processes, it's better to obey them and hope to change them at the next election or the next referendum or the next whatever it may be, because the alternative is blood in the streets. None of which has anything to do with what I was originally going to talk about. Because what I was originally thinking of talking about was to run with an idea I've been mulling over in my mind, which is based loosely upon Hobbes's argument, but goes off in weird directions. He would probably have absolutely no interest in it. To say if there is, and it's a fair argument, there is a kind of social contract. It's a largely informal social contract. So this idea that I've got to pay my taxes and obey the law, we kind of go along with that. As a person born in this country, I've never had to sign a contract. There are loads and loads of people who immigrate to this country and immigrate to other countries, where when they become naturalised citizens, do go through a very formal process of swearing an oath of allegiance and making their pledges, and it's much more in your face, a social contract. Whereas for those born to a country, they don't have to go through that process. I suppose in America there is a sort of swearing allegiance to the flag in school and that kind of thing, which is sort of a social contract articulated out. But many countries don't have anything like that for the native born populations. We do go through a much more overt process in employment. So you take up a job and you get given a contract. And your contract will list all the things you're meant to do in your job, and usually includes a box at the end that says any other damn thing I care to think of on part of the boss. And in exchange, the boss, as part of that contract, has their pledges to you. So your pledge to the boss is you turn up on certain days, you carry out certain tasks, you're there for certain hours, you'll behave in a certain way, or wear a uniform, do this, do that, do the other. And in exchange, your boss owes you a certain amount of money, which will be paid to you on a certain day of the month. And there'll be health and safety rules and regulations that they'll take care of you while you're at work. They might do other things like providing a canteen or a restroom or functioning toilets on the premises, and the whole list of things that your boss is expected to provide in order to ensure that not only can you do your job safely and in a fairly pleasant environment, but also that it's worth your while turning up there because you'll get paid. And there'll be a boss will chip into your pension plan and all that sort of thing. So that's a much more overt form of social contract, a much more obvious one. And anyone who's ever got an official job, I'm not one of those under-the-counter money in a brown paper bag type jobs, but an official job with a contract will have experience of social contracts. So we have that fairly overtly at various different levels. We could argue, and this isn't the key point I want to go into, but it's an interesting one that I might come back to possibly in some future podcast, is that within polytheism, we have a sort of contractual understanding in quite a few different forms of polytheism: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Norse, Celtic, etc., etc., that often there is a sense of what are usually referred to as patron or matron deities. That is to say, whilst we acknowledge 101 different gods and goddesses, a lot of people will have a particular god or a particular goddess to whom they are very closely tied. And it's not quite employer-employee or anything like that, but there is a sense of almost a contract that the deity requires certain things. Certainly think, as an example, Roman religion was an overtly contractual religion, with very much this notion that the peace of the gods and ultimately the peace of Rome itself at a political level, the pax of the empire that extended out across all of the conquered territories, the client states. There was a contract between the gods and the people, and between the empire, the emperor, the empire, the emperor is the embodiment of empire, and all of those conquered territories that were part of the Roman lands, as to who owed what to who, and that whole kind of shifting sets of, I'll do this for you in exchange, you'll do that for me. So the contracts are always mutual. So rather than getting bogged down into terms of the Roman Empire and the contracts of the Peace of Rome, the Pax Romanum, between people and gods, the Pax Deorum, the relationship with the gods, is that on certain festival occasions, certain rituals will be carried out and certain offerings will be made. It might be, in ancient Rome, might have been wine, it might have been spelt cakes placed upon the altar, it might have been the offering of an animal, it might have been incense, it could have been 101 different things that were offered depending on what the deity wanted. And the ritual itself may have included other elements like the recitation of very specific prayers, poems, carrying out of activities like processions, a whole raft of different possible things that may have been engaged in as the fulfillment of the contract towards that god or that goddess on that set of days. And in exchange, the people taking part in those ceremonies were granted whatever it was that that god or goddess offered them, which could have been fertile fields, plenty of crops at the harvest, very fertile animals for their farming, their animal husbandry. So there'd be big flocks and plenty of milk from the cows and so forth, plenty of eggs from the chickens. But it may also have been in terms of winning wars or being protected from wars, so an ongoing political peace. It may have been in terms of protection from plagues and diseases. It could have been a whole raft of different things. Now those contracts, pacts, whatever you want to call them, that existed in ancient times were often at a more collective level. So the community, so this village has a contract with this goddess. So the village has to perform 4 rituals a year or whatever it might be. And they have to do this at this ritual and they have to do that at that ritual, and in exchange the goddess will make sure their fields are fertile and their cows give plenty of milk and there's lots of fish in the rivers and this, that and the other. And often implicit in this idea is that if the rituals are not performed correctly, or they're forgotten about, or the contract is broken in some way, then the goddess or god in question will withdraw their benefices to the people. So the fields will go fallow, there'll be a very bad harvest, the cows will dry up, people will get unpleasant diseases and bits of them will fall off. There'll be one side of the contract is broken, therefore the other side does not have to be fulfilled. In the same way, if you've got an employment contract and your boss hasn't paid you for the last 2 months, you might quite legitimately think to yourself, well, screw you, I'm not going to work anymore. Until you actually pay me, don't expect a lick of work out of me, which is not an unreasonable attitude to take. And so a similar kind of attitude is seen to exist in ancient times, but more at a community level. What we get nowadays in the 21st century within, well, let's say the Western polytheist tradition, because if we're looking to Taoism, Shintoism, Hinduism, well, not all forms of Hinduism are polytheistic, but those types that are, those manifestations are still very much at a community level, with large numbers of people taking part, whereas over here in the West it tends to be much more small scale, more individualist, if you like. So now you might have an individual polytheist, an individual pagan in the West, who has rather than a community contract between them and 3 dozen other people and a deity. It's just a one-to-one between them and a deity. And so they perform their rituals or whatever it is that they're going to do. They give their gifts to the deity, and in exchange they get whatever it is that they get back. And that will vary a great deal from one individual to the next. We also see examples from the ancient world, not just of community-based in the sense of the whole town or the whole village participating, but also what is essentially an early form of guild practice or trade union practice. So one of the ones I find a little amusing is the Aphrodite Porneia, who was an aspect of the goddess Aphrodite in ancient Greece, who had special guardianship and protection over the prostitutes, the sex workers of the city. And there was a festival each year in which the prostitutes would gather in a big parade. It was very open, very public. It wasn't a furtive thing at all because people had very different attitudes to sex work back then. And they would give thanks for the, well, I was going to say thanks for the clients. I suppose it's not so much the clients they're giving thanks for as the money they're giving thanks for. So, you know, this year I've earned X amount of money from my clients, and some other prostitute would say, oh, I earned twice that. And another one would go, oh, I got 3 times that. And they'd give thanks for the amount of money they'd got from their clients in the year and ask Aphrodite Porneia to make their subsequent year, their coming year, even more lucrative. So, you know, they'd get either more clients, or at least better paying clients, and maybe nicer clients in terms of, you know, they'd want, as I'm sure anyone would, if you've got a choice between someone who's horrible, smelly and awful, and someone who's kind and no threat whatsoever. So they would want a better class of client in the coming year. And likewise, you've got lots of other trades and other professions in Greece and Rome and so on, who, whatever the deity of the local town or village was, that particular trade, that particular profession that an individual person, or, well, a whole set of people belonged to, would have the deity of the trade. So the fishermen would have their deity, and the carpenters their deity, and the farmers their deity. So people that a deity they turn to specifically for help with their job, as well as whatever god or goddess they turn to for more community-based, broader issues for the whole village, the whole town, the whole city. And there's you still get the similar kind of thing these days, in that there are quite a few modern-day polytheists who will say, well, you know, I'm a teacher, therefore I'm interested in deities of teaching, or I'm a bricklayer, so I'm interested in deities of building, or I am a gardener, so I'm interested in deities of gardening and herbs and plants and flowers and so on. So they will have a particular deity they turn to who has a vested interest in the type of job they do, and so the kind of contractual relationship, even if the word contract is never used, it's nonetheless perhaps implicit that this is a form of contract, that I will do X, Y, Z rituals, and in exchange I hope to get ABC in return. So there's a sort of a mutual fulfillment going on there. And it becomes an interesting question, what happens when the contract doesn't work? So you've requested, next year I'd like to have earn more money than I've earned this year, and actually next year your money goes down rather than up. So that contract has not been fulfilled. If you have done all of the rituals and offerings and whatever else asked of you, but the thing you've requested doesn't manifest, what do you do? And I'm not going to answer that question, not partly because I don't really know. But it would be interesting, especially if anyone listening to this has that very experience themselves, to hear what you did. Did you feel your contract had been violated, so you flounced away and refused to do any more rituals? Or did you question, maybe, had you made a mistake in the rituals? Had you not done this, not done that? Did you sit and commune and meditate and pray and try to get some dialogue going to say, well, why did you not follow through on the promises? How do you handle that particular situation? All of which is probably more interesting than the thing I was going to mull over, which is this very vague idea, and it is a very vague idea. So I'm doing the usual thing I've done in the past of talking to a camera to help try and clarify my own thinking. So I'm not giving you clear ideas, I'm giving you half-assed ideas that I'm still mulling over. And the particular vast idea I'm mulling over at the moment is the question as to whether there is a, for lack of a better word, and I might come up with a better word later on, but let's call it a natural contract for the moment. So having spoken about social contracts and divine contracts, or I suppose we might call it spirit contracts, because it may not necessarily be a deity, it could be an ancestor, it could be a guardian spirit of some other kind of nature that the contractual relationship exists with. Is there a natural contract? Now, in terms of what I mean by that, partly the idea came from thinking about the apple tree in my garden that I've mentioned in various other podcasts in the past. I do have other trees in my garden, so I don't know why I go on and on about the apple tree, except for the fact that it's the closest to the room I normally do most of my recordings in. Apple trees grow apples, obviously. What is the purpose of the apple? Well, the apple is there to be eaten. That's what it does. And the human or other animal that comes along and eats the apple, whether it's plucking it from the tree or eating it as a windfall, as the case may be, goes off. And they will either, if it's, say, a human or a chimp, an ape or something like that, with opposable thumbs, they'll either go off eating the apple, and when they're finished, lob the core over their shoulder, or if it's, let's say, it's a pig eating windfall apples, they'll probably devour the core, and at some point they will, what's the polite word, excrete it out. Well, not the core itself, but they'll excrete the pips out. And that's the deal that the apple tree gets. It provides fruit which tastes nice and is nutritious and sustaining and everything else, and the animal which gains the nutrition and the sustenance and the nice tastes goes off and disseminates the apple pips, spreads them over a wide area, whether it is by excreting them or just by lobbing the core over its shoulder. It spreads the apple pips rather, out over an area, and some of those pips hopefully will grow into new trees. Now, probably a lot of them don't, the vast majority of them I expect don't, otherwise the world would be covered in apple trees. But at least some percentage of those pips will grow to become new trees, and so that one tree becomes the mother of a dozen, 100, 1,000 other trees over the course of an apple tree's lifetime, as the pips spread and spread and spread over wider and wider areas. That's how that plant, that tree, propagates itself, by providing food in exchange for dissemination of pips. And obviously that's true of cherry trees and orange trees and pear trees and probably 1,000 other types of tree, which spread their pips or their seeds or their stones or whatever it is that they have over a wide area through the means of the animals that eat the fruit that they provide. Is that a form of contract? This is what I'm mulling over. Now, it's not an explicit form of contract. Obviously, the tree doesn't sit there saying, right, I'm going to give you an apple and I want you to take it 3 miles away and let my seeds grow, let my apple pips grow some 3 miles away. Clearly, the tree does not say that. Probably doesn't even think it. I'm not too sure what goes through the mind of an apple tree on a daily basis, but it's implicit as a contract, maybe, in a similar way to the social contract I have with the British state as a natural-born citizen who's never had to go through a citizenship ceremony the way immigrants are required to go through citizenship ceremonies when they naturalise. The fact that I've never gone through an overt formal statement of my British citizenship doesn't mean I don't have it. Doesn't mean I don't have to pay my taxes or obey the law or expect in exchange for obedience to the law. I expect the NHS to run, and I expect there to be general elections, and because I pay my taxes I expect the streets to be swept and the potholes in the roads to be filled. Let's not go there. I expect in exchange for my good citizenship a raft of various things to be done, not for me as an individual, but for the whole community, which I as an individual will benefit from. It's implicit. And equally, you could say that the contract, for lack of a better word, between the tree and the animals eating the apples is implicit. There is no overt discussion of it on the part of either the tree or, by and large, the animals. However, I as a human, and this may be true of pigs, I have no idea if pigs understand the botanical processes of apple trees, Lord knows if they do or not, but let's stick to humans. I as a human understand that apple pips grow into apple trees. I get that, I understand that. So when I eat an apple, now whether it's one I plucked from my tree out there or if it's one I bought from a shop, doesn't matter either way, I have gained the sustenance from the apple. I've gained, and it tastes nice and I get all the nutrients and what have you. Do I then have an obligation to disseminate the pips? So rather than putting it in a dustbin, which will go into landfill and will not have a chance in hell of growing into anything at all, have I rather an obligation, an implicit duty, that I should take those pips out, or just the core itself is probably the easier thing to do, and chuck it in a ditch, bury it in a field, put it somewhere where it's at least got a passing chance of germinating. And whilst I can't guarantee that every single pip from every single apple I chuck out there will definitely grow into a new apple tree, do I have a responsibility to at least give it a chance to do so? Because that's the nature of the relationship between what the tree provides and what I, as the devouring animal, gain from eating the fruit. That I have consciousness of the process and how that process works, and possibly pigs and horses and what have you eating windfalls, they might do, they might not do, I've no idea, but let's assume for the moment that perhaps they don't understand the ins and outs of that process, so maybe they don't have the same kinds of idiotic questions going through their heads. Ought I make the effort as a being that is conscious to ensure that I am giving a fair chance for the contract to be fulfilled, rather than going out of my way to put those apple cores in dustbins and ultimately landfills where they definitely won't get the chance to be fulfilled? Which is a very minor point, I'll grant you that, and shows you how banal my brain is getting of late. But taking that as a starting point, we can perhaps kind of project outwards to think of all sorts of other situations, and I don't just mean with other types of trees, but other situations in the natural world where a process depends on this thing giving a benefit to the life form A, giving a benefit to life form B, and in exchange life form B does something that benefits life form A. So there is a mutual benefit, a cycle, a contract, if you like, a natural contract rather than a social contract between two living beings to provide mutual benefit to each other, providing they both do certain things. Now, the tree provides the apples, whether I eat them or not, or I just sit here and watch them rot. I mean, that's a moot point, but it provides the apples. If I then come along and think, right, I'm going to eat that, do I then participate in an implicit natural contract, which back in the days before anyone invented dustbins and landfill, would have involved me automatically lobbing that apple core somewhere where it would have a passing chance of germinating, the seeds of it germinating. And by extension, as I say, all sorts of other things where if I gain a benefit, I should give a benefit. It should be a mutual process. Now, that could include a whole raft of situations which are not per se natural in the way that the dissemination of apples and pears and cherries and what have you are. So if, well, I was going to say I won't be shearing the sheep because I haven't got a clue how to shear a sheep. But if I wear wool that has been sheared from a sheep by somebody who does know how to shear a sheep, I gain a benefit from the sheep. Have I a moral duty to provide mutual fulfillment to the sheep? Now, obviously, I've got to, if it's a jumper or something, I've got to buy the jumper. So there is money exchanged, and that money, some of it will make its way to the sheep shearer and the farmer and the knitter and the dyer and all these other people involved in the process of making a jumper or a scarf or whatever it may be. But what about the sheep itself? So put to one side for the moment the human beings involved in the process. Now, obviously, some of the money that makes its way to the sheep farmer will be spent on food for the sheep and veterinary treatments when the sheep get ill. So you could say the money I pay for that jumper or scarf or whatever will benefit the sheep. Not necessarily the individual sheep from which the scarf has been made, but the herd will be benefited in a very mild sort of a way. Back in the days when we lived, most of us in much, much smaller communities than we do now, often cheek by jowl, rather, with farm animals, such as, well, throughout most of human history, where the farm animals were often taken into the house during winter, or pretty much everyone had a few ducks or a few chickens or a goat or a sheep or something or another that they lived with and benefited from in some way and fed and looked after and made sure it was okay. Or at least in theory, because I keep seeing these depressing adverts on TV for donkey sanctuaries and donkey charities and things like that, showing people in various parts of the world making their donkeys lug 3.5 tons of bricks up a slope when the donkey looks as if it's half dead, rubbed raw, bleeding, infected, and clearly the person who owns the donkey is such a monumental cretin that it doesn't occur to them that a healthy donkey is a much more effective helpmate in the process of work than a diseased, half-starved, battered, ill-used donkey. And if that's true of today, I'm sure it's been true in human history in general. So perhaps there have been plenty of people who have benefited over the centuries from domestic relationships with animals in which the animal has suffered and suffered and suffered, and there's been very little mutuality to that relationship, even amongst people you would think would have the good sense to look after the animals on which they depend. Whether out of compassion or just self-interest, you'd think they'd have the good sense to look after them, but obviously not. That's a side issue. I have a mutually beneficial relationship with my dog. I was going to say he looks after me. He's affectionate. Like that. He doesn't do much of anything of a practical nature, but he's affectionate. And in exchange, I feed him and take him for walks and water him and take him to the vets and hug him and love him and look after him. All of that. So that's a mutual relationship there, mutually beneficial relationship. What other relationships do I have with plants, with animals, with the world, in which mutuality needs to be much more emphasized than it currently is, which is the kind of line of thought I was vaguely aiming for, although I've missed it somewhere along the line. That perhaps as a result of the vast scale of society, the gargantuan explosion of the human population, the density of the communities we live in, the fact that for an awful lot of the animals we benefit from, we don't see them because they're miles and miles and miles away on farms, and we don't visit those farms, so we never see the sheep or the goats or the cows or the chickens or whatever it may be that we benefit from. And likewise for the plants we benefit from. Again, they're being farmed miles and miles and miles away, so we're not out there in the orchards, we're not out there in the fields. Most of us have very little contact with the plants or animals we benefit from, at least in densely industrialised parts of the world. Obviously there are rural communities where that's the exact opposite is true, and they have very close relationships there. But for an awful lot of humanity, we are very distanced from the living beings from whom we benefit. And that therein perhaps is the problem, that the natural contract is violated, because as with the apple tree situation, where there is a kind of instinctual, old-fashioned relationship with the tree, it gains the benefit of the dissemination of its pips. In exchange, the animals gain the benefit of the food that they're consuming, the apples they're consuming. It works, it flows. Whereas if you place a huge distance from it, it doesn't work and it doesn't flow. So are there things we can do? And I'm sure there are things we can do, where we can sit and think, well, how can I make this particular relationship, the benefit I gain from that plant, that animal, that whatever it may be, to make it more mutually beneficial? Whether that is effectively saying, I've now eaten this apple, so I'm going to place the core somewhere where the pips have got a chance to germinate and grow into a tree, or whether it's saying I'm going to try somehow to take better care of the animal, the sheep whose wool I wear, or the plants that I eat, or the whatever it may be. Can we get a better ongoing relationship? And would that make a good ethos, a good ethic for, well, not necessarily just polytheists and pagans of other ilks, but maybe just humanity in general? One that emphasizes mutuality in all relationships. It's something that needs focusing on. There is a potential problem here, in that if we say, I benefit from nature, so nature must benefit from me, especially if we say it in that tone of voice. Nature is out there and I am here, and we are creating a mental gulf between us, as if I am not nature. Nature is that tree or that dog or that horse or that rose bush or whatever it is. It's that thing over there, and I am this non-nature thing over here. And that's a completely artificial false gulf. So rather, which is in a sense, if you're going for the social contract, Hobbes' social contract as a model, the king, the president, the prime minister is up there, and you, the mere citizen, the mere pleb, are down here. There is a gulf. Absolutely, there is a gulf. And likewise, you could say, if we're going for a divine contract, there is the god or goddess there, and there is you here, and there is a gulf. Whereas in a natural contract, there isn't a gulf, because you are nature. Nature is you. You are part of that system. And it's more akin, I think, maybe to the idea you find in Confucianism and in Taoism, or filial piety. In filial piety, you owe a duty to your mother, your granddad, your uncle, your brother, your nephews, your nieces. You are part of the family system, and you owe certain things to different members of your family, which might be looking after your granny and making sure she's well fed. It might be ensuring that your children are clothed. It might be nipping round to great Uncle Fred's house to read him a book, because he's now half blind and can't read books himself anymore. There's always 101 different ways in which you could be fulfilling familial piety. And it goes two-way street, because just as you are fulfilling your relationship to them, so they have duties and obligations to you, and they have to fulfill them to you. So you look after Uncle Fred, and Uncle Fred looks after you. Sometimes there is a kind of a chronology to it. So the implication is that when you are very small, Uncle Fred looks after you, and then when you're grown up and Uncle Fred is doddery and frail, you look after him. So it's not necessarily the mutuality is taking place in one time frame. It may be spread out over time, but nonetheless, there is mutuality. It's a two-way street. So it's not that the family are over there and you're here and there's a gulf. You are part of the family unit, and that familial piety is fulfilled between all of you. I realise I've pronounced piety in about 15 different ways in that. Never mind, that's a few minutes. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that if there is such a thing as a natural contract, it's better thought of in the same way that we think of familial piety in Taoism or Confucianism, in that you are fulfilling a system of which you are a part, rather than fulfilling a contract with someone who is separate, distinct, and away from you. So it's a much more intimate affair, a much more intimate relationship. And you could, of course, reconfigure your thoughts about other things in that way. So if you want to think of that divine contract you could think of the divine being or whatever, spirit being, whatever it may be, as a family member. And there are, of course, religions that refer to specific deities as father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, uncle, aunt, cousin, brother, sister, whatever else. So those familial phrases are used, perhaps to re-emphasize this notion that maybe what is perceived as a gulf between mortal and divine is not actually that much of a gulf, and it's much more like a family unit than it is a distant relationship between monarch and mere peasant, mere pleb, which is a very distant relationship. It's a different way of thinking about the approach, but that's a separate issue again. There could be all sorts of quite sensible ways and equally all sorts of ridiculous and improbable ways in which we could think about who do I owe a benefit from. So who has benefited me? Which living beings have benefited me? Could be animals or plants I've eaten, or who I've benefited from because I've worn the wool, or the cotton, or the whatever it may be. I've gained some benefit that hasn't necessarily involved the death of the being benefiting me, but I've benefited from them in some other capacity whilst they're alive. What can I do to benefit them? So not only in terms of benefiting the humans involved in, let's say, dyeing the wool, shearing the sheep, knitting the wool and everything else, that kind of crafts trade element of it, but the actual original source of my benefit. Can I do anything direct to them? Which is much easier if you live in a small rural community than if you live in a vast urban one, where you've got these massive distances between the beings you benefit from and at one end of the chain and you at the other end of the chain. And I'm not sure off the top of my head how that could be made easier, how that chain could be reduced so that we see the beings that we benefit from more clearly, more intimately, and can give back to them. And ensure a mutuality in a more constructive way, and especially in this period of history where not only do we have a vast global population, but it's going up and up and up. It's not stabilizing. And so the problem of density becomes likely to get worse in the future rather than better. So I'm a bit stumped on that one. So any answers or suggestions would be useful. But I think I will leave that meandering and wittering there for a while, because that's a bit all over the place. But just a few thoughts, and it would be interesting to get some feedback as to what take you have on these kinds of ideas, whether you think they're ludicrous and ridiculous, or whether you think there's some benefit to them, and maybe more practical applications that you can come up with than the vague notions I've written about so far. Thank you.